Hello. Today we're talking about something that's very dear to me and something I'm particularly passionate about, and that's developmental milestones in our little ones. Now, I'm sure you've all heard this term bandied around, developmental milestones. What it often translates to for most parents is, has my child reached their developmental milestone? And there's a lot of fear or concern around whether a child reaches their developmental milestones at the right time. And I kind of want to debunk that a little bit, because knowing a little bit about how the brain develops and how we develop as humans from birth, maybe we can shed some light on what is important and what's not so important. What I would like to start off by saying is that it is more important that our children reach each individual milestone sequentially rather than when they reach that milestone. So I want to get away from being hung up about when it happens, and I want to focus on about why it happens and whether it's happening in a nice sequential order. As humans, we're born into this world really underprepared. And you think that's astonishing to me, because actually our bodies are so innately wise. We know what to do, when to do, and how to do it. We don't have to think about a lot of these actions. But it is interesting to me that we're born quite vulnerable and quite at risk, really. And the whole point upon birth is really survival. It's really about how do we survive as an individual. And everything that we're equipped with from birth allows that survival. And eventually that survival turns into thrive. What I mean by that is, in order for us to be born as human beings, we have an enormous brain, an absolutely enormous brain. It's quite huge compared to other primates. And in order for the cranium to be born, we need to have that brain slightly underdeveloped. Okay, so actually what happens particularly in those first 3 years of life is we get a huge amount of growth and a huge amount of development that happens. If it happened before we were born, I would postulate that it would almost be impossible for us to birth our children naturally. So we'll put that aside. Anyway, so we're born very vulnerable and really in a survival mode, and very cleverly, innately, our body has provided us with a whole series of what we call primitive reflexes, which are designed purely to allow us to survive in those first few precious months of life. I'm going to just describe a few of them. There are quite a few. There's the morrow or startle reflex, for example. That's when you see a baby reacting to a loud noise, or when they're being placed down to sleep. You'll see them suddenly flail their arms up, throw their head back, and possibly even cry. And we call that the startle reflex. And the point of that is really to fend off predators and to make sure that we can survive in the world, so that we can alert our parents that something's not right. So pretty clever, hey? And there's another beautiful primitive reflex that occurs right from before birth and for the first few months. And that is, if you stroke a baby's cheek, they'll turn towards the stroked cheek, just like this. And that is a very important primitive reflex, because it helps to wire that baby's brain to feed, to go towards the breast, if you like, to be able to sustain itself through its nutrition, through its food, through that nourishment. And there are many other primitive reflexes that are designed just to keep that baby healthy, well, and safe. What cleverly happens is, as our babies develop, those primitive reflexes are integrated into the nerve system, and then give way to what we call postural reflexes. So the other unique thing about this particular primate, the human being, is that we're bipedal. So we have to walk on two legs in a gravity-based world. And we probably haven't given it a lot of thought, but that's incredibly hard. That's a really hard, complex motor task to be able to do. And it actually takes our children at least a year to master that complex motor task. What I mean is for them to get up and to go and walk. And in order for that to happen, we need these postural reflexes to help us to gear up for that next phase of life, and that is to be on our feet and walking. So they come into play after a few months as primitive reflexes are integrated, the postural reflexes come into play. And again, they're about safety. They're about protecting us because we're navigating ourselves from a lying to sitting to crawling to walking. So a really clever one, I think, is what we call the propping reflex. We have the lateral prop. So when a baby is able to sit on its own, after a very short period of time, you'll notice that if you were to gently push that baby to one side, they would put their arm out to stop them from falling over. And why is that important? Well, if they donked over, they would hurt their head, and that wouldn't be very conducive to their development. So it's pretty clever. I'm always amazed. So we have those postural reflexes really trying to gear us up to help us to walk, and then to run, and then to jump. Okay, so it all happens in these beautiful sequential little steps. Now, if we could go back to that newborn brain, which is completely underdeveloped, and essentially the role over the next few years is really to start to, we call it wiring up the brain. Now, you will have heard that term. It's pretty popular at the moment. Wiring up from a neurological point of view, what we mean is those nerves that exist, those neurons that exist in the brain, which do exist there, are unmyelinated. Now, what that means is that they need a sheath, an insulating sheath to grow around that neuron. And what happens when that happens, it means that pathway is going to be much, much quicker. It's like suddenly going from the back road on a congested traffic to suddenly going onto the motorway, 5 lanes, no traffic. Suddenly it can get the message through much, much, much quicker. So we want the nerve system to myelinate. We want the neurons to myelinate because it makes everything much quicker and much more effective and much more succinct. And you'll notice that when you watch a baby, everything's very slow and not necessarily directed. But you'll notice as they develop, things become far more directed. They can suddenly place food into their mouth. When they're a newborn, they can't do that. And again, that's showing us that those neurons are myelinating. They're starting to wire up. Now, wiring up in the brain, again, something that amazes me, occurs through our experience. So we need to experience different things, new and novel things, and we need to do that on a repeated basis in order for a neuron to myelinate, in order for the nerve system to gear up to make it more efficient. So what you'll notice is that you might offer your new child a food for the first time, and they may turn up their nose. And they might turn up their nose up to 17 more times before they'll accept that food. But what's happening is you're exposing them to that new food that eventually their nerve system may accept in. Now, what is also extraordinary is that the development of our babies' brains, or their developmental milestones, occur so that we can develop not only our motor system, so that's our system that allows us to move our body. So first would come gross motor movements, so the bigger movements. So the first thing that would happen after a baby is born is they need to be able to control their head. That's kind of the big gross motor movement that they need to be able to master. From there, we want them to then master, I guess the next big one is rolling. And rolling occurs when they have wired up all of that the nerve system that controls everything that extends our body and creates balance in our body. So the vestibular system, which is your balance, and your extension system, your posterior columns, we need those to wire up in order for the baby to be able to be comfortable on its tummy and then to start to roll. The next big gross motor movement after that is usually sitting. And then after sitting will come crawling, and after crawling will come cruising or standing, and then finally walking, followed by jumping and then running and then jumping. So those are the gross motor movements. The other types of movements we talk about are fine motor movements. Those are the things where we need to be able to use the smaller muscles in order to coordinate ourselves. So it's important for a baby to be able to learn how to pick up things with their fingers so that they can then feed themselves. That's probably the most important thing to begin with. So we have gross motor movement, we have fine motor movement. The other really important part of our development that occurs from infancy through to early childhood is our social development. So interestingly enough, we don't have that ability. We really are just in a very primitive state when we're first born. And what I find interesting is we rely completely and 100% for our caregiver, our primary caregiver, which usually is a parent, for that social regulation. So when a baby is first born, it operates purely out of its right hemisphere, that half of the brain. And the reason for that is it's really important that it starts to wire up that social side of the brain in order for them to survive. So they are really using that caregiver, that primary caregiver, to regulate themselves. So that's primarily why we say skin on skin the minute that baby is born, because it's regulating its heartbeat, it's regulating its sense of safety and security in the world through that caregiver, through that skin, that physical contact. So social development is a big part of those first few years of life. And then obviously we have more cognitive development. So how we learn to use our brain in a more educated way, in a more learned way. And that comes a little bit later on. But we are in full throttle growth and development from the minute we're born. In fact, from way before we're born, but from the minute we're born, it is all about wiring up the brain. So when you hear me talking about wiring up in practice, I'm talking about those neurons becoming myelinated and becoming a really strong connection so that that baby can make that next step. So if we just touch back on developmental milestones, what is most important for our babies is that not when they reach those milestones so much as that they reach them in a sequential way. So the brain is designed to develop in a way that is sequential. So we need certain neurons to wire up before other neurons. And in that way, we want to encourage our babies to do each step in that particular order. Now, for some babies, you will have noticed that they may have skipped a milestone or just not done it at all. And rather than be worried about that, what we would encourage you to do is to work with your child or your baby and just to incorporate those particular steps back into their routine. And there are lots of little fun exercises we can do with children just to help to incorporate movement sometimes, or maybe it's social development, so that they can then wire up those parts of the brain. And the reason this is so important is because ultimately the last thing to come on is that cognitive development properly. And for most of our children, they'll be going off to school. Some of them will be lucky enough to be homeschooled, but we need them to be able to have certain wiring up of the brain, to be able to focus, to be able to concentrate, to be able to sit still for certain periods of time and attend to a certain task. Now, it's not so much about the academics of that, but it's about the ability to be able to do that. And interestingly enough, and not, of course, by perfect design, all of those initial steps up until that point is helping that child to do those next steps. So as a chiropractor, we're completely obsessed with your children's development and really helping that brain wire up in the most efficient, effective way so that they can be happy, healthy, vibrant beings. And what we know is if a nerve system is unimpeded, there is no interference to how it's functioning, that baby's development, that child's development is going to be absolutely on track. So things that will interfere with how that nerve system is functioning is when we don't adapt appropriately to an external or an internal stimulus or stressor, and it causes interference to how that spine is working. Because it's the spine that is protecting the nervous system, and it's the nervous system we're trying to develop in those first few years in order for them to thrive, be vibrant, be healthy, and be well. So you can see I'm passionate about this subject. I have so much more to say about it, but I think that's a wrap for today. We will hopefully share some more information on this in the future.